Welcome to The Mystic Tie, a podcast for Freemasons. I am your host, Troy Sprue. You can find us online at mystictie.com. Email me feedback, guest suggestions, and any other questions at troy@mystictie.com. Grand Masonic Day 2026 took place several weeks ago. We were pleased to welcome Arturo de Hoyos to the podium after his own first joint presentation with Josef Wages. Arturo de Hoyos is Grand Archivist and Grand Historian of the Supreme Council 33rd Degree Southern Jurisdiction and an Executive Officer of the Scottish Rite's headquarters, the House of the Temple, in Washington, D.C. He is the author, editor, and translator of more than 50 books and articles, and considered America's foremost scholar on the history, rituals, and symbolism of Scottish Rite Freemasonry and most other Masonic orders, rites, and systems. We join the event where Arturo will present early Scots Masonry, the Blue Lodge, and the higher degrees. Slides available on our YouTube channel.
I also want to just take a quick moment to acknowledge our sponsors, Acacia Lodge being one of them, and also the luncheon sponsor this year is Ashlar College of Freemasonry. And so Ashlar College, very generous donation to help offset the cost of the event and keep ticket prices reasonable. I wouldn't say cheap, but I'll say reasonable. And so just a big thank you to the brethren on the island and to the brethren at Ashlar College. So with that, I am now pleased. I've already read the bio that I Frankensteined together from what I could find online of Arturo. But I'm now going to have our second presentation of the day on early Scots Masonry, the Blue Lodge, and the higher degrees. I now welcome Arturo de Hoyos.
Okay. I'm going to speak today briefly a little bit about the evolution of ritual to help us understand the relationship of the Blue Lodge to some of the so-called higher degrees. And in particular, we'll look at how some elements of the Blue Lodge were preserved in other systems of Masonry, in particular, what we call the York and the Scottish Rites. So obviously we can't recite hundreds of years of ritual history in our short time together. So most things are going to be omitted here, but let's look at some things that we do know and maybe a couple of things that we don't know and try to make some reasonable guesses at some of the things that we don't. We do actually know quite a bit about some of the events that contributed to the evolution of Freemasonry. We know, for example, that in 1598 and 99, some 15 years after the Scottish King James VI appointed William Shaw as master of the work over Masons, that Shaw issued his famous statutes would help to form the basis of government for Masonic lodges. Among other things, his statutes defined a hierarchy of wardens, deacons, and masters in all things concerning the craft. The lodges were to be presided over by a general warden, while William Shaw himself presided over lodges in his country, similar to the way the Grand Masters do throughout most of the Masonic world. We can't say when the first Masonic initiation ceremonies occurred, but by 1630, we were hearing of the Mason word in Scotland. And at the same time that the lodge system was developing in Scotland, the London Masons Company became active in England. There's evidence that as early as 1630, some Masons within the London Masons Company underwent an exclusive privilege of being admitted to something that they called the exception. The precise meaning is not completely clear, but we know that it represented an initiation into a group that embraced both operative and non-craftsmen. Masonic traditions come from a variety of sources. Perhaps the two most important were English and Scottish. The earliest traditions of the operative Masons are known principally from a collection of documents that we refer to as the Old Charges or the Gothic Constitutions. I think there are about 27 of them. And they were basically the rules of conduct and regulations. And they included traditional or mythical history also. The two earliest of these constitutions are the Regis manuscript and the Cook They're now dated around 1410, 1420. The oldest known of these old charges are of English origin. We used to assert that the Regis manuscript dated to about 1390, but recent studies in the language that appears in the document itself pushes it closer to 1410. A form of the old charges was adopted by the Premier Grand Lodge and printed 300 years ago in 1723 is, of course, the very famous James Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons. The origins of some of the other traditions are not as clear. I've always liked this drawing, and I included it in one of my books. It was retitled The Raising of the Master. The original sketch by Guarancino, he lived from 1591 to 1666. It seems to have a Masonic feel about it. You see a dead body being measured with a ruler or gauge. Another person holds compasses over him. Finally, a third person has his arms raised above his head, perhaps shouting. Nothing is really known about the context of this drawing, and the original is in possession of the Supreme Holy Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland. Although the earliest charges are from England, the earliest known descriptions of Masonic ritual are from Scotland. This one, Thomas Martin's narrative, Freemasons' Word and Signs, dates to 1659. I mentioned it earlier. And it mentions only fellow crafts and masters, which were one and the same. In operative masonry, a master was a fellow craft who held the building contract. Another manuscript, the Edinburgh Register House manuscript of 1696, mentions the entered apprentice and the fellow craft. It explains that during the initiation ceremony that the candidate received certain secrets on 5 points of fellowship, and it was on the fellowship portion, not the apprenticeship portion, so it was in the highest level. The ritual has many things that would be familiar to us today, but also much that's different. We know it's not a complete description because it alludes to things that it actually doesn't describe. The early constitutions included mythical traditions on the antiquity of Masonry. Among the biblical patriarchs, many of them were said to be Masons. And one of the most interesting is a story about Noah. A trace of this legend and the primitive tradition was alluded to in Anderson's 1723 constitutions that says that the great ark, though of wood, was fabricated by geometry according to the rules of Masonry. And it added that Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth were all Masons true, and brought with them over the flood the traditions and arts of the antediluvians. Anderson's New Book of Constitutions of 1738 further stated that the Mason was to be a true Noahite, and it referred to Noah and his sons as these Masons or 4 grand officers. We believe that Anderson included these references to Noah because the Grand Lodge had recently made a change or a modification to the ritual and wanted to keep it tied to these older traditions. That a document known as the Graham Manuscript of 1726 includes an account which says that following Noah's death, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth lacked particular knowledge that Noah had before he died. I'm going to read a small extract from the text. It says, "Now these 3 men had already agreed that if they did not find the very thing itself, the first thing they found was to be to them as a secret. They not doubting, but did most firmly believe that God was able and would also prove willing, through their faith, prayer, and obedience, for to cause what they did find, for to prove as veritable to them as if they had received the secret at first from God himself at its head spring. So they came to the grave, and finding nothing but a dead body, almost consumed away, taking a grip at the finger, it came away joint to joint, so to the wrist, so to the elbow, and so they reared up the dead body and supported it, setting foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, cheek to cheek, and hand to back, and cried out, 'Help us, O Father, for our earthly father cannot.' So they laid down the dead body again, and not knowing what to do, one said, 'Here is yet marrow in the bone.' A second said, 'But a dry bone.' And a third said, 'It stinketh.' So they agreed to give it a name as is known in Masonry to this day." Any of that sound familiar? We'll return to that in just a bit. So it's important to recall that when the first Grand Lodge was founded in 1717, there were still only 2 steps in Masonry, not degrees. 2 steps or 2 levels. And that the Master Masons, which was the first, what we call high degree, was first conferred probably in 1725. There's some evidence that it may have existed at the end of 1724, but for sure by 1725. We know that the apprentice degree was split into 2 parts to create the fellowcraft degree, and the material from the older fellowcraft degree was also used to create the Master Mason's degree. Similarly, material from these earliest degrees would migrate into other so-called high degrees. Let's look at an example. In one place in the Edinburgh Register House manuscript, which was written in 1696, it tells us that the key to the lodge lies in a bone box. And just a few years later, in the Dumfries manuscript, it says that the key was kept in a bone box and that the head is the box and the teeth are the keys. Later, rituals modified and clarified this language. By 1730, Pritchard's Masonry Dissected was published, which we spoke about, and it explains that the bone box opens and shuts with ivory keys, which, of course, are the teeth. By the 1760s, this language is found in a degree known as the secret degree, and it was one of the so-called higher degrees. We find it preserved in these higher degrees, even though it came from craft masonry. So if we look at the dates at which the high degrees begin to appear, we'll notice that they're in extremely rapid succession. In 1717, the traditional date of our founding, we have only 2, apprentice and fellowcraft. 8 years later, in 1725, we have the Master Mason's degree, first conferred. 8 years after that, the Scots Master degree appears. We don't know who invented either the Master Mason's degree or the Scots Master degree, but we do know that both were considered regular and conferred in regular lodges. As we learn from the Graham manuscript, when Noah's sons attempted to raise his body, it first grasped at a finger, and then the joints separated, then grasped at a wrist, and finally it says, so to the elbow. That grip at the elbow was an important feature of the Scots Master degree, and it remains with us in various forms of that degree in other rites. The Graham manuscript, which dates from the creation of the Master Mason's degree, can be seen as a kind of like jumping off point for higher degrees. So, what is Scots Masonry? As early as 1733, we find a reference to a Scots Mason's Lodge in one of Richard Rawlinson's manuscripts. The name Scots in Scottish didn't mean that the degree arose in Scotland. It's believed that early Masons who were aware of the important role that Scotland played in our craft ritual development called the degree perhaps out of honor. The term later came to be used collectively to refer to the best and most learned Masonry. Today, it's common to refer to these degrees and their descendants by the French term Écossais Masonry. A Scots Mason's Lodge was listed in an engraved list of lodges in 1734, and again on an engraved plate in 1735. This image was taken from that. We also see that it was lodge number 115. Early period Masons held lodge meetings in convenient places, such as bars or taverns or a wealthy person's home. And the taverns also or often had exotic names, just as some do today. You see that Scots Masons met in the Devil Temple Bar. It's a great name, isn't it? The first known Scots Masons, as I mentioned, met in this bar, which we see illustrated, but it was very short-lived. We believe that it started in 1733, but was erased by the Grand Lodge only 3 years later in 1736. The fact that it met in the Devil Tavern is important because it was the favorite of a meeting place of the Grand Lodge, as Albert Mackey noted in his Encyclopedia of Masonry. Mackey said that for a long time after the revival in 1717, Masonic lodges continued to meet as they had done before that period in taverns. Thus, the Grand Lodge of England was organized and used the language of Anderson. The quarterly communications were revived by 4 lodges whose respective places of meeting were the Crown Ale House, the Apple Tree Tavern, and the Rummer and Grapes Tavern. For many years, the Grand Lodge held its quarterly meetings sometimes at the Apple Tree Tavern, but principally at the Devil Tavern, and kept the grand feast at the hall of one of the livery companies. This is a plate that listed early English lodges. It's the one that I extracted the previous image from that shows the Scots Masons as lodge number 115. The church also appeared in Bernard Pickart's Religious Ceremonies and Costumes of All the Earth's People that was published in 1735. We know that from 1735 to 46, there were at least 4 lodges conferring the Scots Master degree in southern England. We don't know much about the original language of the early Scots degree. We know that its conferral required 3 officers and multiple people could receive it in a single degree. And one of the interesting things about the Scots Masonry is that the degree was owned or controlled by the heads of the lodges before there were separate Masonic rites. So what was going on in these lodges? If we look a little closer at this early list of lodges, we see that the Scots Masons Lodge, the one from Devil's Tavern, wasn't the only particular lodge. There are 3 others, lodges 116, 117, and Lodge 120, which were called Masters Lodges. Well, about 130 years ago, Brother John Lane, a Masonic historian, noted something peculiar about these lodges. None of them had ever been warranted or paid for a charter, but they were all completely regular. So what was going on in these unchartered lodges? The answer is they seem to have met only for the purpose of conferring degrees above the fellow craft. We don't have a copy of the original Scots Master ritual, but we have really good ideas about what was happening in there by comparing earlier versions from French and German and then finding the commonalities between the two so that we can pretty well suppose what happened in that early English ritual. Okay. So from about this period, we see the emergence of high degrees. On October 28, 1735, at the lodge at the Bear in Bath, the Lodge of Masters met Extraordinary, and several brothers were made and admitted Scots Masons, Scots Master Masons. In 1738, we have the testimony of worshipful Brother Hugo O'Kelly, who testified before the Portuguese Inquisition that he became a Mason in Ireland about 1734-35. He said that there are more classes of Masons which were called excellent Masons and Grand Masons, which are above all others. In Minute Book C of Old Lodge Number 1 in London, which met at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, we read that on June 17, 1740, 9 members of this lodge were made Scots Master Masons by Brother Humphrey, whose lodge met at the Morning Bush Tavern in the Aldersgate Ward. Also, in 1740, we find a clear reference to Scotch Master Masons conferred on normal Master Masons, as we read that at the lodge at the Rummer in Bristol on July 18, 1740, it was ordered and agreed that Brother Thompson and Brother Watts and any other member of this lodge that are already Master Masons may be made Scotch Master. This is true evidence that this was considered to be a higher degree. I owe this illustration right here on this point to Joe. Where's Joe? It's just sitting right here. Joe Wages. Hiding? Okay. In any case, he pointed this out to me. Within a couple of years, we see Scottish degrees appearing in France and Germany, and several hints in early German records point to their likely English origin. The worshipful and most respectable Scottish Union Lodge was founded in Berlin on November 30th, 1742 by 7 Frenchmen and worked in French before the rituals were translated to German. The French titles of the officers were translations of those found in England rather than the traditional titles used in France. Similarly, the regulations emphasized that the customs of the Scottish Union Lodge would conform to those of English lodges. The book Le Parfait Maçon was published in France in 1744-45, and it has particular relevance to the development of high-degree Masonry. In a section called The Secret of Scottish Masons, the author wrote, and I'm quoting, "It is said among Masons that there are still several degrees above that of Masters of which I have just spoken. Some say there are 6 in all, and others go up to 7. Those called Écossaise, or Scottish Masons, claim they are the 4th degree. As this masonry, different from the others in many ways, is beginning to be known in France, the public will not be annoyed if I relate what I have read about it, which seems to give the Écossaise a degree of superiority above the apprentices, fellows, and ordinary masters. Instead of weeping over the ruin of the Temple of Solomon, as their brethren do, the Écossaise are concerned with rebuilding it. Everyone knows that after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, the great Cyrus permitted the Israelites to rebuild the temple in the city of Jerusalem. That Zerubbabel of the house of David was appointed by him, that is Cyrus, the chief and leader of the people to return to their holy city. The first stone of the temple was laid during the reign of Cyrus, but that it was not completed until the 6th year of that of Darius, king of the Persians. It is from this great event that the Écossaise derived the epoch of their institution, and although they are later than other Masons by several centuries, they consider themselves to be of a superior degree. The earlier rituals of Scots Masonry continue the Hiramic legend and those events. It was not concerned with the rebuilding of King Solomon's temple, but rather with the rebuilding of the temple. So, by comparing French and German translations of the Scots Master ritual from the 1740s, we identify the common elements and surmise what was most likely in that English ritual. Among other things, the Scots Master degree detailed the discovery of the name of God. Although the accounts differ slightly, it was said to have been discovered by medieval Scottish knights beneath broken columns at the ruins of the Jerusalem temple under the foundation stone, either in silver bowls or on a metal plate. This tradition was alluded to in the confession of John Custos, made to the Portuguese Inquisition in 1743, when he said, quote, "When the destruction of the famous Temple of Jerusalem took place, there was found beneath the first stone a tablet of bronze, upon which was engraved the following word, Jehovah, which means God." Custos added that it was in England where he learned all that he confessed to this board. If Custos wasn't a Scots master, he was well acquainted with them. In 1732, he was a founding member of London's French Union Lodge, to which Jacobo Fabris also belonged. And we know, in 1742, Fabris was a founder of l'Union Scots Master Lodge in Berlin. A symbol from that ritual, seen here, shows the broken pillars and the foundation stones with the initial of the true lost word. Without going into too much detail, we can see from this tracing board that the Scots Master degree contains some of the old traditions of Masonry, such as the Tower of Babel and Noah's Ark. We also see Hiram's grave in the upper right, and the cord which was used at his burial. At the bottom are the cross pillars, 3 circles symbolizing the 3 bowls beneath which the divine name was rediscovered. Aspects of the Scots Masters, such as the particular steps, coffin with ropes, broken columns, etc., were perpetuated and preserved in the Scottish Rites, 5th degree perfect master, while the discovery of the lost word was told in his 13th degree royal arch and 14th degree perfection. And the tradition of chivalric ancestry and the rebuilding of the temple were preserved in the 15th degree Knight of the Easter Sword and 16th degree Princes of Jerusalem and other degrees. We here see the Scots Master symbol of the broken column, stone, and word preserved on the apron of the 5th degree perfect master on the left in the Scottish Rite, while it also appears in a modified form in the St. Andrew's degree of the Swedish Rite. The Scottish writer and educator Andrew Michael Ramsay, better known as the Chevalier Ramsay, lived most of his adult life in France and was associated with Masonry from its beginning there. In 1737, he wrote his famous discourse in which he connected Masonry with the Crusader Knights. But he also alluded to the rebuilding of the temple when he said, quote, "This union is made after the example set by the Israelites when they erected the second temple, whilst they handled the trowel and the mortar with one hand. In the other they held the sword and buckler." Well, for many years, people assumed that Ramsay's discourse inspired the creation of Masonic chivalric rituals. We now believe it's more likely that he learned of the Second Temple tradition from the Scots Masters. Masonic historians have noted that Scots Master's degree was popular in England up until the 1740s, when they disappeared, about the same time appearing in France and Germany. As the Scots Master degree disappeared in England, the Royal Arch emerged, as we mentioned this morning. And it's really interesting to see so many of the common elements. We explained why some of this happened, but it makes perfect sense. I'm just going to reiterate something that we said earlier, that during the mid-1740s, the Jacobite rebellion occurred. This guy right here, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, was a pretender to the English throne who spent less than 14 months in Scotland during his entire lifetime. His family were the Stuarts, one of Europe's most enduring dynasties, with the claim to unite three kingdoms, Scotland, England, and Ireland. The Jacobites, who took their name from Jacobus, Latin for James, were supporters of the movement to reinstate Charles' grandfather, Roman Catholic Stuart King James VII, and his heirs on the throne after their exile to France in 1688. There's a coincidental Masonic connection here. Bonnie Prince Charlie's tutor was the Chevalier Ramsay. In the middle of this Scottish rebellion, no self-respecting English Freemason would want to be called a Scots Master. But the same English Freemason would be a perfectly acceptable Royal Arch Mason. So we believe that they did what we mentioned earlier. They dropped anything remotely connected to the name Scottish from the degree, made some slight revisions, and we have the Royal Arch. Freemasons supported the Jacobite movement. Those who did would have been perfectly comfortable in France and participated in degrees perpetuating the Scottish name and tradition, which is why we still have remnants today. So with the question, are you Scots Master or a Royal Arch Mason? The answer is it depends upon who you were and when you lived. Recognize this guy? The person who connects the English high degrees with the French Ecossaic tradition and brings into the New World is, of course, Stephen Morin. And what I love about this image is this was actually created for a talk that Joe and I did, 10 years ago? Something like that. Somebody found it online and thought that it actually represented Stephen Morin, that it was an image of him. And so I don't doubt that in history books in the future, Joe's picture is going to appear as Stephen Morin, as well it might. Maybe he's the reincarnation of Stephen Morin. But so although we don't have a real painting of him, I think Joe's painting will do. You look pretty good with that wit, by the way, Joe. So what we do know, as we mentioned earlier, is that he had received these degrees, the Ecossaic degrees, and he was the chief power in promoting the degrees, both in France and in the New World. We mentioned that he had been captured twice at sea as a prisoner of war by the British, first in 1744, 1745, the second time in 1762. On his second capture, he spent 2 months in London, where we mentioned that he became an acquaintance of the English Grand Master, who appointed him as inspector of its jurisdiction in the New World and gave him power over the sublime degrees. Morin was more than a Masonic enthusiast who collected degrees. He did tremendous revisions to them, and we actually believe that he also authored ritual. So one of the rituals which Morin had acquired was this one, the Perfect Scottish Elect, or the sacred vault called the Square. And a note at the end of the ritual states that this is what he received in 1744 from the Governor General William Matthew of the Leeward Islands, we mentioned earlier, and that he later used to establish this degree in France. The ritual includes a lot of important points, some of which we made, that are common to both the Scottish Rite tradition and the Royal Arch. Among the interesting things is that this ritual includes the phrase, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God." The phrase, of course, continues to be used in many English rituals of the Royal Arch today. It also has the word divided into three parts that's used in both the Lodge of Perfection and the Royal Arch degree. As we pointed out, the only difference is whether it was written with a J or a G, depending on whether he spoke English or French. A further confirmation of the relationship between the Scots Master and the Royal Arch is in a 1746 letter written by a certain brother de, who told his correspondent, quote, "By inspection of my letter, you can easily know that I am a Scots Master. I should be able to prove it to you by the words under the vault." This, of course, alludes to a practice that's very well known to Royal Arch Masons. It's interesting to note, as we said, that the word sacred vault is the same thing as Holy Arch. And in fact, it is both a Scottish degree as well as an Ecossais degree, as well as a Royal Arch degree. Morin is famously known as the founder of the 25-degree system called the Order of the Royal Secret, which was the parent of the Scottish Rite. Although we know that he received his patent from France to spread the high degrees in the New World, we also know that he expanded his powers and revised degrees. For many years, it was wondered what rituals he used. This ritual collection of 29 degrees in France's National Library is known as the Bailiwick and 415 manuscript, sometimes called the Saint-Domingue manuscript, dated to 1764. And it includes a large collection of Ecossais degrees, many of which became part of the Order of the Royal Secret. And Joe has done some research to show that there are good reasons to believe that this manuscript was owned by Stephen Morin. Joe and I actually had the opportunity to handle the original manuscript in the National Library in France a couple years ago, which was very, very fun. Some of the language in these degrees literally translate word for word with what Henry Andrew Franklin, his deputy, Morin's deputy, translated into English and are found in his copies of the manuscripts. So I realize that this is a lot of history here, so I'm going to come to an end, but bear with me just a little bit longer here. So let's summarize that early Scots Masonry first appears in London in 1733. It refers to a type of higher Masonry considered superior to the craft degrees, but acknowledged by the Blue Lodges as regular Masonry. It quickly moves to France and Germany, where it's worked on both sides of the Atlantic. It comes via Stephen Morin to the New World. Morin gathers these degrees, working with his deputy, Henry Andrew Franklin. And through the two of them, they create the 25-degree Order of the Royal Secret. So when the First Supreme Council of the Scottish Rites organized in 1801, it inherits all 25 of these degrees. In its earlier days, it also had two sets of constitutions, the so-called secret constitutions, alleged to date to August 1761, and the so-called constitutions of 1786, which are to date considered to be the government for the Scottish Rite. The secret constitutions explain that the 33-degree system was comprised of three rites: ancient, modern, and Scottish, or Ecossais. The ancients and moderns were, of course, the names of the two rival English Grand Lodges, with the Scottish being the system of superior degrees that started in 1733 and by meandering roads concluded in becoming the Scottish Rite in 1801. Thank you, brethren.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Let's have a seat and we can ease into the Q&A section. Again, I'm gonna use my prerogative to ask the first question. So, is it redundant for us to have degrees in both? And let me preface this by saying I have both been exalted to the Holy Royal Arch and am a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. So let me just preface that this is not about one being better than the other, but the question is it redundant for us to have degrees in Scottish Rite and Royal Arch that are effectively the same with variations or omissions? Or is there an argument as to why it's a good thing?
I think it's a good thing. I've also been very active in the York Rite, past presiding head of all of the York Rite bodies in my jurisdiction in Texas. I enjoy it because the degrees are not identical, although they're based on the same story. They both preserve aspects of these older rituals that the other one doesn't have. So we get more of a complete story or a fuller story by belonging to these two different versions of it.
I think and I think that's probably something you guys are working on, probably publishing, but that lends the question is where the 33rd degree came from.
Yeah, John, that's something I always push away from my audience is that we've discovered certain manuscripts that point to the origin of the 33rd degree. Like I could say that we have smoking gun evidence that, I hate to leave people hanging, but I'm not inclined to reveal that until we publish it. But we do have some documents that have never before been published, and we can draw direct parallels and quotations that show that we have a really good idea how the 33rd degree came about. We're going to publish photographs of the documents to show that we're not even making this stuff up. Because I think that some people are going to be kind of shocked because this has been the big mystery of the origin of the Scottish Rite, where the 33rd degree come from. And I think that, I'll tell you this, is that you and I were talking earlier about Alain Bernheim. Unfortunately, Alain passed before I got this published, but I did show him the evidence, and he pretty much bowed to the fact that the mystery had been solved.
Brothers Remiak, two questions. First, Masonic tradition informs us that Pythagoras actually encountered the degrees. Does your research incorporate any Pythagorean thought or study?
Yeah, there's no evidence that any of those, ancient traditions, of masonry evolving in Egypt or Greece or wherever it may be, that there's anything real there. Albert Pike used to say that masonry had a body and a soul. One is the symbolism. The other is like the corporate structure in a way, the things that we do. And so it's perfectly acceptable to say that like our spiritual inclinations can come from many sources, but practically we know where we came from as a body. So Masonic traditions are very eclectic. They've borrowed from all sorts of sources. And we're going to identify some of those in our publications also, where some of them came from. I'll give you an example. There's a wonderful 2-volume set of books in German on tracing boards that was published by the German QC Lodge in Bayreuth. And in the back of it, the author, whose name is Federson, last name, is able to show the influence of publications that were contemporary with the development of Freemasonry. So Masons being eclectic, there was no need to reinvent the wheel. We simply borrowed and adapted those traditions. And it's the same thing with the allusions to earlier cultures, esoteric cultures. There's no evidence historically that links us to the ancient past or to Pythagoras or any of these other traditions. They're part of our tradition, and they add value to the character of our degrees and to our philosophy, but we don't have a historic connection to them any more than we do to the historic Knights Templar. I know that that's another topic that's very near and dear to people, but there's just no evidence of it. And we have a lot of reason to believe that or understand why these things were introduced to the craft, just like we continue to make modifications in our rituals today. But it's Masonic tradition.
I'd be curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the modifications in ritual that we're making today, because, particularly with the Baltimore Convention and other key moments, we have seen a steady push for systems of degrees and rites to be locked down in, who owns them is sort of just set now, and AMD gobbles up whatever it can get along the way. And things have become standardized, and there's been a push to standardize ritual, regalia, all these sorts of things. So I'm curious about, when you say modifications in degree, what are some examples that you might be able to share with us?
Well, let's look back before the Baltimore Convention. We mentioned Thomas Smith Webb earlier. Most people know who Webb was. Do you? Hold your hands up if you know who Thomas Smith Webb was. Okay, he's often considered to be the father of the type of ritual that's used primarily throughout the United States and some places here in Canada also, is that what he did was he had a copy of the Exposure Jachin and Boaz, as well as the writings of Preston and Brown and some of these other English ritualists. And he produced a type of ritual, which was an improved form over that commonly used in his lifetime. And so he believed it was an improved form. There's some people who dispute that. Well, when Webb taught his ritual, he took on students, and for a fee, he allowed them to transcribe the ritual in a 1, 2, or 3 letter cipher in little books. And so many of these little cipher rituals, manuscript cipher rituals, still exist today. And these are the ancestors of the cipher rituals, which you'll see sold, used to be illegitimately, but now many Grand Lodges publish them. The problem is that if you didn't have perfect recall, you couldn't remember what every letter stood for. So in one case, let's take the letter I. The ritual book would have that, and some person in a jurisdiction would be received on the point of a sharp instrument, and in another state, a sharp implement, because they're very similar, but they couldn't remember what it stood for. This is why some of the prayers refer to the great architect of the universe and others the grand architect of the universe. Both start with the same letters there. Or the lights are placed at, about, or around the altar because they all started with the letter A. We say to pay the craft their wages if ought be due or any be due. Again, begin with letter A. But my favorite example is what I call the WTF in Freemasonry. Well, of course, I mean whether a certain word in the fellow craft degree means waterfall or waterford. I don't know what you're all laughing about, but we actually do know is that Bibles that were printed in the early 1700s sometimes had marginal notes. And I found an edition that had a note there in Judges referring to the word, and it says, "This signifieth a fall of waters or an ear of corn." Well, no self-respecting American is going to say fall of waters. We'll say waterfall. And so by that confusion, someone not being able to remember, we have variance there. And so some of these variations occur simply because of a lapse of memory. Others were regional. Let's say, for example, that you had a skilled carpenter in your lodge who produced elaborate and beautiful candlesticks or candle holders. So your lodge had, 3 foot or 4 foot tall candle holders at the altar. Another local lodge doesn't. Those begin to take importance, and they might even have an emphasis in the ritual applied to them. And we've seen this because there are certain European branches of Masonry where they evolved into the 3 pillars and the lights are placed on top of them. So there's all sorts of reasons for variation in Masonry. We retain some things. I quoted from the Graham manuscript today where one of them said, "There is yet marrow in this bone." Well, the Graham manuscript was written in 1726. 100 years later, William Morgan prints his infamous exposure in New York, in Batavia, known as Illustrations of Masonry, by one of the fraternity who's devoted 30 years to the subject. And in the Master Mason's degree, he explains that the word, substitute word, means marrow in the bone, the same phrase that occurred 100 years earlier, but between those, within that century of elapsed time, there are no other documents that include that language. How remarkable is it that oral tradition survived, right? There are very few places that retain that. Joe and I both belong to lodges in Texas, and we still have that phrase in a particular place in our ritual today. New Hampshire also preserves it, but most Grand Lodges have lost it. The Baltimore Convention, being an attempt to standardize ritual, really lost a lot of things. Imagine going to, restaurants and they, it's a French diner and they say, "I'm sorry, we've standardized all the types of food there are. We no longer have the, creme brulee the way that you like it. We're doing it the way that corporate now tells us." So that's kind of sad, I think. There are lodges in which there are tremendous variety. If any of you have visited a lodge in Bristol, then you know under apprentice degree, something very amusing can happen in that degree if the candidate wasn't paying attention. And some of those things, like I say, are very ancient traditions. So I speak out saying I am in favor of these ritual variations. They are the spice that gives character to the meal.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because we here in our grand jurisdiction, of course, have 4 official recognized workings, which explains why the Vancouver Lodge of Education and Research installation looks the way it does. And so I think it's great because it's an invitation to ask questions about why some of these rituals might look differently, why the altar might be called a pedestal and moved to the front, or these other things. And so I think there's a real tension today in Freemasonry around continued efforts to standardize and to regulate, and efforts to preserve, nuance.
Example. Has anyone here visited a lodge in Pennsylvania? A ritual in Pennsylvania. Anyone seen that? Okay. Tell you something really interesting that they do is during the initiation, the principal officers leave their stations, stand at the altar in the middle of the room. The candidate is led around their back. He taps them on the shoulder, and they all turn around and ask, "Who comes here?" Anyone have any idea why that happens? If you look at engravings of early Masonry, the lodge was a carpet that was put down on the ground with the officers standing around it. The candidate was led around their backs, and the same thing happened. It wasn't until we built our own lodge rooms and we pushed the stations against the wall that the candidate was obliged to walk inside rather than outside. Pennsylvania calls itself Ancient York Masonry. They are happy to preserve a tradition that's some 300 years old.
And of course, they did not sign on to the Baltimore Convention either, did they? Yeah. A quick question about, you mentioned Webb and how that predates the Baltimore Convention. Basically, the Baltimore Convention, his ritual is sort of selected as like, let's go with this version here. And yet, I'm trying to remember if it's your annotated Morals and Dogma, or where else I saw it. But you call to attention a quote, I think by Pike, that basically says that the followers of Webb and his degree system are like charlatans and scoundrels. And can you elaborate a little bit more on why Pike felt so strongly about that ritual?
Yeah, that's in the introduction to Esoterica. Yeah. Pike didn't believe that Webb had dug deep enough into the meanings of symbols, but rather that he simply went with the superficial, commonly accepted explanations, couching them in perhaps a little better language, but not really digging any deeper. And so that's what it was. And so he produced his own work, which you've read, in which he tried to go to the earliest known uses. And this is why I think it's important to do that, to look at these earlier forms, because sometimes something, as I showed with this example of the ivory key, we discover that what you might find in a so-called higher degree is simply something that was lost from early craft masonry, and that the high degrees are not the enemy of craft masonry. In fact, at times they preserve earlier traditions that were discarded in ritual revision.
Well, I was going to ask a question, but I think you answered it. But me being a Washington State Mason and having such close ties with my British Columbia and Yukon brethren, one of the things I can't help but notice is the difference between movable and immovable jewels. And ultimately, like you talked about the Baltimore Convention, where we talk about how we sort of solidified that. But I was kind of wondering if you knew where we deviated to begin with, where we had this 2 schools of thought.
The 2 schools of thought regarding
so in
with the movable and immovable jewels,
flip-flopping that like between the 2.
Yeah, it's not proven, but that I'm sure you know about this already, is that some people thought that it really ought to refer to the stations of the the principal officers of the lodge. That's why they are immovable, because they're situated in the cardinal directions. But these types of things also, if you look at like Morgan's exposure, There were two Grand Lodges in New York at the time that Morgan wrote his expose. He belonged to what was called the Country Grand Lodge. There was also the City Grand Lodge. And if you look at the two versions of ritual that were used at that time, you'll see that they pretty much make up the current New York State ritual, that it incorporated elements of both of those things. After Morgan's ritual was a more primitive type. And for example, there were hailing signs in all of the degrees, in the craft degrees. So there were variations of those. It was just that throughout the expansion of the United States and the fact that people were able to travel quicker between the states than earlier times, they simply wanted to be able to recognize Masonry for what it was, because there were so many variations. There were some states that worked, a dozen different types of ritual within the one state. There were not committees on work like we have today that taught a standardized form of ritual. You had a person that was a lecturer that would travel around for money and teach particular lectures that satisfied people. I mean, the lodges needed someone to instruct them. So we don't even know if the terms movable and immovable were the original terms for those, because we find variations of those in older forms of ritual.
I don't know if Trevor's in the room right now, but I believe, Trevor, you gave a presentation, was it last year, I think, around one of the traveling salesman, orator, ritualist who actually was very influential in the Pacific Northwest, and where arguably some of our, lectures, originate from the Barney ritual, is it? Yeah, the Barney ritual. So any other questions from the audience? Yeah, there we go.
Hi, I'm Benjamin, first-time caller, long-time listener. First of all, thanks for being here and everything you guys have been doing today. It's very informative. I was just wondering, of all the symbols and everything that you've been talking about, is there any that you feel which one carries the deepest meaning?
That's really hard to say. I think that's personal. But one thing that I've always liked is Albert Pike's explanation of the square and compasses is that, the square is used in geometry to measure the straight lines and angles by which we measure the earth. So it's a temporal symbol, whereas the compasses are used in spherical trigonometry to trace the motions of stars. So it is a spiritual or heavenly symbol. And so as you make progress in Masonry, you see the compasses dominating the square, or the spiritual subduing the physical or the material. And so Pike believed that signified that was making progress in Masonry. It was the habitual practice of the individual to subdue his desires, appetites, and passions. So I always thought that's what the goal of Masonry is too, of course, is for us to become masters over ourselves. So the square and compass, perhaps, the oldest of Masonic symbols, I always thought was still extremely important.
We are going to go to lunch in a moment. If anyone has one final question here for Arturo, I remind you that we will have a summary panel discussion later on, and I feel like I'm sitting on a real humdinger of a question, which I'm looking forward to asking. But brethren, we will go to lunch now, unless there is one more burning question, and just a big round of applause for Arturo de Hoyos.
Thanks for listening today. You can support the show by liking, sharing, and subscribing on your favorite podcast syndicator. Even more helpful, leave us a review. We are looking to create a directory of Freemasonic events and publications. If you are aware of something coming up, please let me know by email. In the meantime, check out the Masonic Conferences website at MasonicConferences.com. Esotericism and Freemasonry Conference will be held on Saturday, September 19th. Our keynote speaker will be Lon Milo Duquette, author of The Tarot Architect. Ike Baker and Brother Doug Russell will also attend. Get your tickets in advance by RSVP to esotericmasonry@gmail.com. For other events, check out our calendar at mystictie.com, and don't forget to sign up for our newsletter while you are there. Graphics and web hosting are by Artsabo Creative. A special thanks to Organist for our theme music. Happy to meet, sorry to part, and happy to meet again.